Now we will look at Telangana arts and crafts, symbols and icons. Before going into symbols and icons, which sort of came very late after the formation of the Telangana state, we will look at the arts and crafts. What we look here in the context of arts and crafts is largely handicrafts. And before going into this category of Telangana arts and crafts, we need to understand the very formation of the category, because these handicrafts did not exist with the formation of the state, or did not come into existence with the formation of the state, or they did not follow this idea of the identity of Telangana. Okay, so what we see, certain crafts, certain arts that were practiced in this region, which later to be called as Telangana or Telangana state. So this region in which different kinds of art forms, dance forms and folk forms of expressions existed, and these sort of transform and appropriate and absorb different kinds of influences from outside, and they sort of very beautifully blend into a sort of a language. They adopt, they sort of domesticize different foreign influences, and they sort of imbibe and expand the languages of the expressions of arts and crafts. So what we need to keep in mind is these are largely sort of organic living traditions. Okay, these are not things that form like at one point in a time, like in the context of, let's say, the mainstream art, the modern art or the mainstream art. We can trace from where they have come or when they have started. So there were projects of starting certain institutions when it comes to the modern context of art. But when it comes to the handicrafts or the traditional, these are basically traditional arts and crafts, they do not follow a sort of an existing institutional definition or existing institutional structure, but they sort of evolve, grow and change according to the kind of patronage, according to the kind of responses of the people who are patronizing, as well as according to the shifts in the society and culture. So it's organic in that sense, it's not fixed, though we see certain technical fixities. Techniques of expression are really institutionalized. Techniques are something that form, and the technique continues. So within the technique, for example, of weaving or casting or painting, the technique and the basic structure of the expression, basic structure of the language would be more or less intact. But within that technique and within that basic structure of expression, you have evidences, you have examples of imbibing different kind of external influences. So this is why we can call them as living traditions. These are traditions that existed from quite many centuries from now, and they are still existing, and they are going to exist. And you have they are being practiced by the traditional families. Basically, these handicrafts, one important thing one needs to keep in mind is the handicrafts and the traditional crafts and arts are practiced not by one single artist or artisan, but the entire family is involved. So it is not like one person is making an object, but it is almost like occupation. So these arts and crafts were also occupations of these families. So these families are not isolated. Again, they are part of the larger social fabric. So larger social fabric means they are part of the system, part of the caste system, part of the caste hierarchy, right? And most of these craftsmen fall in the lower category of the caste hierarchy, right? So they were basically the manual sort of craftsmen. So they come under the lower category of the caste structure that we have in the Indian subcontinent. So having said these basic points and the basic sort of an introduction, when we look at the actual art forms, what happened in Telangana is, in Telangana I mean in the region, in the geographical region of Telangana, where you have a particular dialect of Telugu is spoken, right. So before this so-called Telangana region and Telangana state very recently that is formed, before the consciousness of Telangana identity, what we had was the Hyderabad state, right, ruled by the Nizams, and then before that we have the Hyderabad Deccan, the entire Deccan ruled by the Qutub Shahis and other Deccani Sultanates, right. So when we look at, let us say, Hyderabad state itself, which had largely parts of Maharashtra, parts of Karnataka, and you have parts of Chhattisgarh, what is Chhattisgarh now. So you have a different map altogether. So they were then, before let us say 1956, they were called the arts and crafts of Hyderabad state or Hyderabad Deccan. So what one needs to understand now when we say Hyderabad Deccan, and because of the influence of the Islamic culture that came with the from the early medieval times, from the 14th century onwards, we have lots of Persian influences coming in and the influences from Iran. So those forms of craft, textile to metal crafts and various other crafts, so those sort of came as the soldiers, for example, or the people came from there. Those forms came to the Deccan region and they sort of settled here, and with the existing social forms and with the existing sort of cultural and crafts forms, they sort of got combined, right. So for example, Bidri, when we look at Bidri, this is just an example to begin with. Bidri comes from, Bidri did not exist in Bidar, right, which is now in Karnataka, but during the Nizam's time it was part of Hyderabad state. So which is like, we now consider Bidri as part of Telangana crafts, right. So it comes from Iran actually, the technique, the form, the visual dimension of it, and the usage also, right. So we have many examples also in textiles like that, where forms were coming, techniques were coming from the outside and they become localized, regionalized, and they assume the identity of this region, right. How do the forms of this particular region gets identified? Because they get the foreign forms that come here and they sort of take a ground, they gets localized, and they acquire local forms and local tastes and local color, and with that they assume the identity of this region, which is now called as the Telangana region, and the arts and crafts that exists in this region called Telangana arts and crafts. So the initial, as I said, the initial influences were coming. If we also look at Deccani miniature, initial influences were coming from the northern India, like Rajasthan and the northern part of India. The visual forms, the visual art forms were coming from the northern part of India, as well as the Persian styles, right. So we can see that, for example, in Kalamkari, if we go to Machilipatnam and the port region, Srikalahasti, for example. So Kalamkari is a very good example of reflecting the Persian influence, in terms of forms. So apart from the northern Indian, as I said, Persian styles of art have flourished, here since the times of Qutub Shahis and Nizam. So it is the medieval times, it is 15th, 16th century, and Kalamkari has a long history which goes back into the pre-medieval times also, but it gets more and more flourished, Kalamkari as a technique. But when it comes to forms and the images on the textile, it is the Persian style comes during this medieval time. This is the beginnings. This is how the forms have been inculcated into this region, right? Now, apart from this, what we have in the local, not things that came from outside, but in the local were something like 𝗤𝗏𝗄 painting. There are other forms, but we will look at 𝗤𝗏𝗄 painting, which is more prominent now. Lot of research has been done, and let us look at this slide on the screen that you have. How does 𝗤𝗏𝗄 painting look like? It is largely done by a particular sect, and it is not only painting that you have. You have, along with the painting, you have a narrative. That means a balladeer, a singer would narrate and sing about the story that is represented in the painting, right? So 𝗤𝗏𝗄 painting is done in this place called Cheriyal and in Warangal, and they were largely scroll paintings. This is very important to keep in mind, where Cheriyal paintings traditionally were scroll paintings, right? So let us look at this particular image, and then later we can go in detail. What you have is, in the center you have a blue god standing, right, and holding the mountain with his little finger, and you have a cow right behind him. So we can see that this is the story of Krishna, right? So in the center, the central frame gives you the central theme of the story. This is about Krishna, right? So this is Krishna lifting Govardhan mountain, and you have people around, and you have his friends around, and you have cows, and they are all taking shelter under him, and he's standing in his typical style on one leg, and the weight drawing on one leg, and then you have a mountain covering the top portion, and you have in the center Krishna standing, and on either sides, very in a balanced manner, figures are represented. So this is the central frame, and surrounding the central frame you have small frames, and if you look closely, all these small frames actually narrate visually about the events of Krishna's life, Lord Krishna's life, right? The Krishna Leelas. Different kinds of Krishna Leelas, where he is fighting with demons and playing, and his entire life story. It's almost like a biography of Lord Krishna, right? But how they are represented? They are represented in small frames, right, on either side and top and bottom. So when a singer would talk about this, he would narrate in a song, and the song is largely written by himself. So this is a group of people, a group of craftsmen, artists or artisans, who work with singing as well as the image. It's very important to keep this in mind, because when we look at 𝗤𝗏𝗄 painting, we only look it as an image, but it is not complete when you look at it as an image. It is accompanied by the audio. So the audio visual dimension is very important here. It's more like a cinematic experience. So the balladeer, the person who would sing, would point at each and every frame, and he would sing about it, right? So each and every event, and he would sing about it. So he would open the entire story while he points at each and every frame in this. So this is how it is used for entertainment, but in the pre-cinematic time, and in the traditional, and we all know that the traditional ways of entertainment, where such kind of events would go on throughout the night, right? So you have this story would go on for hours and hours, right? So like any other performances, right, where the performers would perform, that may be Ogukatha, that may be Burakatha, or that may be any other sort of performance form. This is a performance form, but which is a very different kind of a combination of image as well as the song, right? And the song, and most of the themes, the stories come from the epics, right? And the important thing one needs to keep in mind is, though we know the epics of Mahabharata and Ramayana and also Bhagavad Puran, largely 𝗬𝗏 paintings draw their themes from the episodes of these epics. They take small episode and they paint and they sing about it. So, but the way they would imagine, the way they would narrate, and the language, the dialect, that is very much local. Maybe, if it is located in 𝗬𝗏 in Warangal, you have a Warangal Telangana dialect which is used, and the local sort of coordinates of imagination. We have local ways of imagining stories, right? So the local flavor is very important to keep in mind when we think about the epics. The epic, we have various ways of narrating the epics, right? So this is one of the ways of narrating the epic or epics, where the singing and the literature, the lyrics, the lyric is sort of based on the local understanding and the local imagination, right? So you have a sort of a complete indigenous imagination of a larger epic which is national right now, right? I mean, which had a sort of, we claim that, Mahabharata or all these epics are Indian epics, and they existed in different regions as different stories, right? So once the story of one region appears very different from the story of another region, right? So we have multiple narrations of the same epics. So that is very interesting when it comes to looking at the folk arts, how they get localized, And moving on to the next slide, what you have is a sort of a small information here. The scrolls are painted in a narrative format. So the narrative format is more like what we can relate with the film, right? How the film rolls, where the film would roll and open one frame after another. So when we don't see what comes next until unless the roll comes down, unless the film comes down, right? So the film opens one frame after another, right? Like the comic strip also. So here the singer, the person who sings, does not show the entire piece sometimes. They open it as they go along, or sometimes they open it but they point at the story or the episode that they are discussing or narrating, right? So it follows the audiovisual language of film, both in terms of the structure as well as in terms of the experience, the way the film would roll, right? So as I said, depicting the stories from Indian mythology and intimately tied with the stories, shorter stories from the Puranas and epics, right? So these Puranas and epics get also sort of interjected by the local sort of stories, So and the kind of the tradition, this particular tradition form became an inseparable part of the profession of the storytelling. So this is a storytelling, but these were belonging to, the storytellers were belonging to this community called 𝗂𝗏𝗺 𝗂𝗏𝗺, they, apart from the balladeer community, they were also mendicants, in the sense they would travel from one village to another to do these performances, to do this storytelling, right? So, so they would be called, like, for example, they are coming tonight for our village, so the villagers would be ready, right? So the event would be organized and patronized by the entire village. And remember, these paintings were not supposed to be bought separately, which is happening now, right? These scroll paintings were part of the larger practice of singing, right? So they were now detached, but they were not supposed to be painted sold separately. They were carried from one village to another, and these performances of storytelling used to be conducted, right. So, one needs to understand the entire story, one needs to understand the entire history and the practice of charial painting. What now happens in the context of charial is very different. So, looking at this particular slide, the next slide is it is a scroll, as you can see here, and I have a detail on the left side. The scroll is very old, I mean not very old, but 1925, and they used to earlier paint on cloth, and you see this community would not have a lot of money to buy new materials or new clothes to paint on it. So, they would paint on the old clothes, for example saris, right, or they would paint on the old white cloth, and then they would use an old sari to as a base for it, right. So, so these were largely in scrolls, and you have the scroll divided into the bands like comic strips, you can compare it with, and then you move one episode after another and the story will unfold. It goes on like that. So, what happens later, and this is a small fragment, this is a small detail of the scroll that you have seen. Very bright colors again, as you can see, these are all earth colors, and the tamarind gum is used, or gum arabic is used, and largely the colors are grounded using the earth colors that are found around, right. So, but if you look at the language of painting, which we haven't discussed, the language of painting could be related to the language of image, could be related to several other practices that exist in this region, not only in Telangana, but you can go down to Lepakshi, and you can go also down to Tanjore, and there are relations. We do not know if they have actually kind of interacted, but we can see some kind of a relation visually one can see they are sharing in terms of representation. And the kind of figure type, generally in these kinds of practices, they have a typical standardized figure type that they would repeat, and you can see that here, and you can also go back and see in the scroll where one kind of figure is repeated. And repetition, again this is another point one needs to keep in mind, that repetition of one figure multiple times is nothing but the transition of that figure from one point in time to the another as the episode travels, as the narration undergoes, as the narration unfolds. Something happens in the morning, and then the story goes on, and the same person can be seen in the afternoon. So, as the time transits, you can see the repetition of the figures is to kind of suggest the traveling of the time. It is more like cinema, where you can see the same figure sort of could be seen throughout the film, or at multiple stages of the film. It is more or less a kind of a logic which is similar. So, what happens now is something like this in the next slide that you see, something like this, where you see the elephant and the elephant rider, and it is nice, it is a sort of a circle, and you also have squarish paintings, where today what is happening is, because long stories from mythologies have been cut short. Why they have been cut short? Because the patrons were not, because these scrolls were not to buy, and you have museums and other collectors have collected, but the larger middle class expansion, and the middle class expansion also led to the patronage of such format, right. This is more or less a modern format, like squarish, and the format that you can put on the wall. But charial painting was never meant to display on the wall, right. It had a sort of a performative and a sort of a belief associated with it. But nowadays what is happening, and you can actually go buy in the stores, charial paintings could be bought, but these are now produced in square format. They are the entire episode and the story is cut, and a part, maybe a minuscule part of the story is shown in this one particular square or a circular or a rectangular format. So, this is a result of the modern consumption. This is a result of the modernization and the revival of charial painting, where because to sort of provide patronage to these traditional artisans, the state has introduced a space of market where these artists are making these small square format paintings of the charial tradition, and they are now selling as small paintings that can be hung on the walls in your drawing room. So, this is a transition, and this is something that one can see is continuing from quite many centuries, going back before the Islamic sort of influences, and you can see that. Maybe you can also see some kind of a miniature influence, we do not know, but yeah. So, charial painting also can be seen, the same artisans are also producing these dolls, right, and masks. So, these masks are also used. I mean, you have, for example, in Adilabad, in the remote interior forest regions, the tribal rituals, for the tribal rituals, these masks were used, are still used actually. So, this is a sort of an example where these are not used, of course, but these are a transformed form, a transformed sort of a usage where these are dolls produced for the modern consumption, where we can go buy and keep them in our drawing room as a showpiece. So, this is an example of that. And now we have discussed charial extensively and the transformation. Now, let us move to 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧, another craft tradition that exists in this region is 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧. 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧 did not originate here. It originated in ancient Persia, and it was brought to India by the followers of 𝗂𝗽𝗻𝗄𝗎𝗪. So, these followers brought 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧 to the Deccani region, right. So, then it developed during the 14th century during the under the rule of Bahmani sultans. So, that region largely is Bidar, which is now in Karnataka, but pre 1956 when the state was formed, Andhra Pradesh was formed. Before 1956, Bidar was part of the Hyderabad state, and till 1956, 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧 was largely patronaged and propagated about by the Nizam's government, and you have many exhibitions, and 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧 was sent to many exhibitions, and it had become very famous from the 19th century itself, when it was discovered by the discovered in the sense its importance was discovered by the British connoisseurs, antiquarians, and British craft aestheticians, right. So, it came from Persia through Moinuddin Chishti, followers of Khwaja Moinuddin Chishti, and it started around 14th century in Deccan, in the place called Bidar, right, around 14th century under the Bahmani sultanates, and it came to be called 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧 because it is produced in Bidar, and it is related with this place very intimately. And why is that intimacy? Because the soil, the soil plays a very important sort of role in the production of 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧 ware, right. The soil that they found in Bidar, particularly in the unlit places of the Bidar fort, where the sunlight does not go, does not penetrate. So, in that areas of the Bidar fort, these artisans found the soil and the quality of the soil. That soil is used for the production of, for the oxidization of 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧 ware. 𝗧𝗦 wear happens in at least 8 stages, right? From making the shape to making it, from filing and then making incisions and then filling it with silver wire and then oxidizing it and then polishing it. So it undergoes in several stages, right? So in those stages, in the later stage, this soil is used with ammonium oxide, right? So for polishing, and for that oxidation, basically for the oxidation, the soil plays a very important role. That makes the 𝗧𝗦 look dark, that black. So it's basically a gunmetal material. It is a copper alloy, copper and zinc alloy, right? So the main body is done in copper and zinc. So you can see on the slide that you have here, which shines, where you have the black portion and the white portion that you have is basically silver, and the white portion is filled with the silver, where they would remove the that portion. So they would scoop out and then they would fill, which is called inlaying. So they would fill in the silver in those regions, in those areas, right? So the material is copper and zinc alloy, and then it is oxidized, right? So what you have in terms of, apart from the material and metal, you have very intricate forms on the 𝗧𝗦 wear, and you have different kinds of objects produced, hookahs, different vessels, spittoons, you have boxes, and you have various kinds, you have jewelry also. And it was 𝗧𝗦 was also used for making sword handles and different kinds of objects with which you can make, like with the, where you can use metal. But when it comes to the visual element, when it comes to the ornamentation, you will see the ornamentation is very much close to Persian ornamentation, but at the same time the local influences also get into it, right? And at a later point of time, Ajanta's floral ornamentation also sort of influences the 𝗧𝗦 ornamentation. And in the modern times, you have the ornamentation also becomes slightly abstract and largely geometric abstraction. So 𝗧𝗦 is one of the prominent crafts of what we call as Telangana state or the Telangana region, right? And it's the prominence came during the 20th century largely, right? These crafts were identified in the early 20th century, and they were sort of made to or they were sort of reformed for the modern taste, right? So after 𝗧𝗦, another metal craft that we see is filigree. This is largely, filigree happens in different parts in India, but in the context of Hyderabad, Deccan and now Telangana, filigree is it happens in Karimnagar, right? Karimnagar is famous for filigree, and filigree is a technique where by using silver, 98% silver, but it is not casting, it is not molding, it is by using just a thin wire of silver, the craftsman would construct the entire form, right? So you can see on the slide here where you have a peacock and a sort of box and holder, where you have intricate sort of designs, but all these intricate designs are produced by using just one thin line of thin wire of silver, right? By using the silver, and they would construct it, and then sort of it grows almost like organically by constructing the pieces, the thin line, thin wire of silver. And you can see this in the next slide, where a craftsman is actually putting this silver wire together to make a bigger form. So you have various kinds of objects produced, and apart from 𝗧𝗦, Filigree was also very famous, not only in Hyderabad, not only in India, but these objects also went to London, and they were very in demand. They were very much in demand and praised for their intricate workmanship, right, and very beautiful ornamentation. So they were very famous, and they were collected in the 19th century, particularly in the Britain and other cities in Britain. So after the filigree, we can have another practice of metal where brassware, and this region is also very important for brassware. So different utensils, and at a later point of time it is also called as 𝗵𝗵𝗀𝗃 brass utensils, where by beating, apart from casting, you also have a tradition where you would use the metal sheet and you would beat it and create forms. So the slide that you see here is a very old image. These are exhibits coming from 1920s. So this is an old image. So this shows the existence and the refined practice that has been there in this region about the metal craft. So this is one of the examples of metal craft of particularly the brassware, and example of 𝗵𝗵𝗀𝗃 brass utensils. Another metal craft in this slide, the next slide that you see, is 𝗬𝗧. Again, 𝗬𝗧, like most of these metal crafts, exist throughout in different regions of the South Asia. So 𝗬𝗧 exists in Adilabad in the context of Telangana region, but it also kind of exists still now, where artisans would produce these are Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, Odisha, and West Bengal, right. So these are largely done by Ojha metal smiths. So these are called the craftsmen, the sect or the group of people who produce these are called Ojha metal smiths or Ojha community. So it is a unique sort of casting technique. Unlike the earlier forms that we saw, this is a very unique kind of indigenous casting technique, but it is a lost wax method. Lost wax method we can also see coming from Italy, but this is very much indigenous in the sense the materials that are used are very much different from what we see that are used in the West or in the context of the Italian metal casting. This is largely bronze or brass, and how the form is produced, and this is lost wax because there are two kinds of metal casting, where one is the solid cast, another is the cast where you can have the empty core, where you can have a hollow cast. Inside you don't have solid metal, but you can have a hollow space inside. And how is that done? So you produce the form, as you can see here in the 𝗬𝗧 process, these thin lines could be produced, right. So these thin lines are produced by using a locally produced wax, right, and that is used, and it can actually be stretched. Okay, you can stretch it to thin threads, and by using those thin threads, very much like the filigree of Karimnagar, but that is not a casting technique, this is a casting technique. So by using those thin wires of wax, you construct this form, and you can see here the thin lines, and by using the thin lines only, the artisan has used the decoration also, the ornamentation also. So you can use the thin line and create the entire form, right, and that entire form is covered with a core, right, and you create a hole to the core, and then you pour metal inside it. What happens in the process is the wax, because of the heat of the metal, the wax gets evaporated, which is the wax gets lost, right? You don't see wax. So in the place of the wax, you have this metal that goes in and sits, right? So wax is lost, which is why it is called lost wax method. So 𝗃𝗧 is very much prominent now. It is famous, and it is again collected by, it can be bought and it can be collected and kept and used. So this is one of the examples, and they are producing different kinds of objects, like for example in the next slide you can see this is a sort of a showpiece tortoise, right? So they existed, the metal craft largely existed in the tribal regions, tribal zones of all these states that I mentioned. Basically these, again, one needs to also keep in mind when it comes to 𝗃𝗧 is these craftsmen were also kept outside the village. These craftsmen were considered as untouchables, right? They also belong to the lowest of the lower strata of the caste system, right? So which is why they are relegated to the end of the village. When you look at now maybe the equations are different, but conventionally, traditionally, these metal craftsmen were living at the edges of the village. And let us move to the next example of crafts, which is Nirmal toys. Nirmal toys, the name comes from the place called Nirmal village in Adilabad district again, and it is famous for toys, painting. You have squarish paintings, also furniture. So largely the base is wood, so they would create very beautiful lifelike birds and animals, which are toys, which can be displayed and which can also be collected and kept in the showpieces, kept in the showcases. But before the modern materials that were used now, apart from the wood, they used to use the earth colors, the local earth colors, not the synthetic colors, earth colors, and they used to use lacquer for the coating. Now, if you go to the Nirmal industry, they produce with synthetic colors, the deco colors, and they would also use the synthetic polish. But earlier, Nirmal toys and Nirmal objects were produced by using the local materials, by using the indigenous earth colors and indigenous gum, and then coating it with lacquer for shine. So that was the earlier process, and of course the base was largely wood. So Nirmal, the anecdotal story goes that the community in Nirmal, again, where does Nirmal come? Nirmal form comes from. It comes from, again, it had a sort of a Persian link again. So where in the earlier time, these artists were, the group of artists were not staying in Nirmal actually, and it is during the late medieval, it is during the late Qutub Shahi time, where before the 𝗳𝗏 time. So it is around the 18th century where these people were brought and kept in this place called Nirmal. And before they start making toys, they used to make the handles for swords, they used to make handles for knives, and handles for different armory, right? So slowly, after the armory was not required, when people stopped fighting, they shifted to making different other objects, which is toys, furniture, and painting. And if we look at painting particularly, and also the furniture, the ornamentation in painting, as you see in this slide, is very much close, the language of painting also is very much close to the miniature painting. Otherwise, where can we see this kind of an image, this kind of figuration is coming from, right? So they share a lot of visual, if not similarities, but sort of a thread with the miniature painting. But the technique is entirely different, right? And the purpose is also very different, and the materials that they use is very different. But they could have had a sort of an influence, or the early artisans could be coming from the miniature tradition, where the miniature patronage was sort of declined, right? So there could be various other reasons, but what is evident is the link with the miniature practice, right? And the other example that you see is the furniture in the context of Nirmal. The furniture, again, the ornamentation on the furniture again comes from the Persian sort of influence, and at a later point of time in the early 20th century, the ornamentation is deeply influenced by the Ajanta ornamentation, the Ajanta paintings. The ornamentation, the floral ornamentation that we have in the bands of Ajanta murals, that influences immensely the Nirmal imagery, and you can see that if you want further, you can actually go look at the Nirmal furniture and Nirmal painting. Let us move to the textiles from toys. What are textiles is rich again in the context of Telangana, and that goes back into the medieval times. So dharis are very important. So the slide that you see here is of one of the dharis, and Warangal was a very, which is still, Warangal is a place where you have all these dharis and carpets and rugs were produced, and which are still produced. Mostly these were cotton, woolen, and largely cotton and woolen, and sometimes silk, but extensively cotton and woolen. So the dhari that you see here is of cotton and geometric shapes, and the technique again comes from the Persian influence, right? And the very concept of carpet is a Persian concept, right? So dharis and carpets were where, when the, again during the medieval times, the early medieval times, when the migration of people from Persia, largely these were soldiers, right? The soldiers and the craftsmen, when they came here, they sort of settled in these regions, Bidri in one context, filigree in another context. This is dharis, which is largely in Warangal. This is another, where these craftsmen and soldiers, they settled here even when their kings left them, like even when the kings moved, they sort of settled here and they established this tradition. So which is why now we can have this continuous tradition followed and produced in Warangal. You can see in the next slide two examples of dharis, again same. These are cotton dharis, and you can see the same kind of ornamentation, the geometric ornamentation. And this geometricity and the geometric ornamentation, again one can see going back to the Persian influence, apart from the floral Persian sort of images in the textile or the dharis, you also have the geometric, which comes from again the Islamic influence, right? So now you see it is more like the next slide you see is more like a sort of a Persian small carpet, and these were also sort of very popular during the 19th century. And one needs to keep in mind, when these arts and crafts became more and more prominent and more important for the modern culture, for the modern society, is during the late 19th century, right? This is just a sort of a tangential information, but which is very important to keep in mind, that all these crafts, arts and folk forms that we see, they got prominence and attention in the late 19th century and in the 20th century, and particularly in the context of Hyderabad, it is in the 20th century, under the Nizam's patronage, you have them coming onto the surface, coming on into the prominence, right? So let us move to the next slide, which is Pochampalli Ikat. So after dharis, we can now look at some textiles. Ikat is more famous, like Pochampalli is more famous for ikat, a particular kind of textile tradition where yarn is dyed. The design is actually planned when the dyeing of the yarn is done, right. So, it is not that the plan or the design is planned on the loom, right, not on the loom, but it is planned, the design is planned when the dyeing of the yarn is made. That is very complicated, and which is why it is very significant when it comes to the technique of ikat. Ikat exists in Pochampalli, also in Odisha, and also in Gujarat, and all these ikats are very different in terms of the local techniques, in terms of the local forms. So, the example that you see is Pochampalli ikat, and it is largely they use the organic colors and cotton as well as silk. So, these are the two materials, cotton and silk, but dyed with organic colors. And again, here also the entire family participates in it. It is an extensive and laborious process where you have to calculate each and everything, and which is why when you look at ikat forms are not clearly defined. As you can see here, for example, the white, or the threads sort of diffuse, the color diffuses, the form sort of blurs and diffuses into the surrounding, into the adjacent area, right. So, the area of one form merges with the area of the another. The borders of the of one form merges with the border of the other area, right. So, this is the character of ikat. It happens because of the technique itself, where the dyeing happens at the stage of yarn, and then that goes on to the loom, and in that process we can see a sort of a beautiful language of textile emerges, where the forms sort of blur and merge into each other, a sort of the borders blur, which is the character of ikat. And this is another example which is sort of a more modern example of ikat from Pochampalli, and now they are experimenting, and they are sort of influenced by the fashion industry, and lots of new designs and experimentation is taking place in the context of ikat in Pochampalli. And other next technique, next textile is 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧 sarees. 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧 sarees are also very old textile tradition that exists again in this place called 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧. It is largely the sarees, cotton and silk, but largely cotton, and 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧 sarees are famous for their borders. The border is made of jari, the golden jari. So, which is famous, like 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧 sarees are famous for this flat colors and the borders. The borders are actually rich. The entire saree, as you can see here, the entire saree is the flat but rich color. The colors are very rich, and the borders are also rich with the ornamentation in the zari, right. So, the ornament is only in the zari and not in the not in the body of the saree, unlike Pochampalli ikat. So, this is the color is more important, the brightness of the color is more important. Again, the dyeing is done by organic colors, and then later when goes on to the loom. So, 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧 sarees were also famous during the Nizam's time. In fact, they become internationally renowned during from the early 20th century onwards. And let us move to the other textile tradition, which is not very popular, but very beautiful and very famous when it comes to the textile history. This is himru and mashru. These are two different forms, but more or less shares a sort of similar technique, right? So 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧 is basically a sort of a imitation of 𝗂𝗽𝗱𝗁, right? 𝗂𝗽𝗱𝗁 was produced, again it's a Persian tradition. 𝗂𝗽𝗱𝗁 was produced entirely in silk and entirely in gold and silver, and they were worn by the kings and queens, of course. And 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧 is just an imitation of it in silk and cotton, right? So it is very soft, very lighter, and very gorgeous, right? So the slide that you see on the screen is a variety of examples of 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧 particularly, and Aurangabad is famous for 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧. Aurangabad is not part of Telangana now, but before 1956, Aurangabad was part of Hyderabad state, and 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧 was part of Hyderabad textile tradition, right? So 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧 is now also available in Hyderabad, and you see it is being revived now. So it is very gorgeous, and the ornamentation again can be seen coming from the floral, from the Persian influences. And moving on to the next slide, you see another two examples of 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧 tradition. And 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧 is another example, right? And 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧 means 𝗧𝗑. 𝗧𝗑 is nothing but law. So 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧 also feels the same, gives the same experience, but it is more geometric, but not the floral ornamentation. What happens in 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧 and 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧 is the cotton yarn is used for wrap and silk is used for weft. So which is why you have on the surface you have a softer effect, but underneath you have a cotton body, right? So let us now move to, so we have seen the text arts and crafts of this region, and let us quickly move and look at the icons of Telangana state. And these are new icons identified and ascribed the state identity. The state bird is the Indian roller, which is Palapitta, and the state animal is deer, and the state tree 𝗳𝗦𝗔𝗧, and the state flower is తంగేడు. So these were basically identified as state symbols in the recent years in 2015. And blue jay or Indian ruler, as we can see, Lord Rama spotted this particular bird when he was invading Lanka, and he vanquished Ravana. So it is a mark of victory, right? So the Telangana state has used it as a path to victory, right? And achieving the statehood is also a mark of victory, but it also symbolizes a path going forward to the victory. And the next is deer. This is the animal, again has links to the epic Ramayana, and we have deer as a very it has been associated with Indian history in many references. So deer also has a sort of a very prominent role in the Indian history and mythology. So deer as the state animal. And 𝗳𝗦𝗔𝗧, as we can see, it is celebrated, it is worshipped for again the sense of victory, where the Pandavas kept their weapons on it when they went to exile in the forest, and then when they were forced to go to the exile in the forest, and when they came back they worshipped and then removed, take down those weapons, and they again became victorious. So this is also a symbol of piety and victory. And the flower, the తంగేడు flower, is very popular and very famous and very mundane. It is used by women folk, used by the people of Telangana extensively in most of the cultural forms and the festivals. So it takes a prominent position and appearance in the context of Telangana. So after these symbols, we have two icons, two emblems. One is an emblem. This next slide that you see is the emblem of Telangana state, which is designed by the artist called A.L.A. Lakshman. And what you have here is very interesting sort of a design. You have on the top you have the lion capital of Ashoka, which is the emblem of Indian state, the Indian nation, and you have the Torana, the Kakatiya Torana. So the emblem, the Indian emblem is sitting right on the top of Kakatiya Torana, and down there you also have the Charminar, right. So you have all these emblems which capture the history or the legacy of Telangana and Hyderabad, and on which you also have the association of India, and it is circled in the green. Green is a representation of prosperity and the peace of Deccan, and the gold is again the idea of flourish, right. So you have these very symbolic sort of implications of color and the symbols. So this is chosen as the state emblem, right, and you have down there you have 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧, written in Hindi. So you have three languages here, Government of Telangana in English, in Telugu and in Urdu, but outside you have this 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧, which is something that goes on from the 20th century, early 20th century on. So the last slide is this Telangana Martyrs Memorial, which is produced in 1975 by an artist called, a sculptor called 𝗂𝗽𝗍𝗪. It was to mark the sacrifice of the Telangana lovers and the Telangana fighters who died in 1969. So this particular image, which is this particular memorial, is established in front of assembly in the gun park, and very interestingly sort of composed in the geometric forms and very modern looking, very abstract in conception, where you have the Ashoka chakras on the top, the symbol of justice and peace, the lotus, the symbol of peace, but done in a very geometric form. And if you come down, you have these sort of the forms coming from the Buddhist chaityas. So you have this very symbolic sort of implication of peace and the legacy of peace that the Telangana or the Hyderabad region has. So we have seen a range of visual expressions, emblems and icons that emerged recently, but the arts and culture, arts and crafts that goes on living from centuries from now, and they evolve, they transform as the society transforms, as the tastes of the peoples transform, and the demands of the market also. So that these aspects, these external aspects are important when we study the actual forms of arts and crafts. Thank you.